What if the most powerful weapon on Earth doesn't detonate, it negotiates? What if it can move borders without redrawing maps and topple governments without firing a shot? It is a signature on a loan, a paragraph of conditions, a whisper that turns into a market stampede. And for nearly 80 years, it has been hiding in plain sight, the International Monetary Fund. You're watching Hidden Finance, where we pull back the curtain on the institutions that quietly steer the fate of nations. If money makes the world go round, we go under the floorboards to see who laid the tracks. No dramatics, just the truth told with the weight it deserves. Settle in, turn the volume up, and let's step into the room where economies are remade, not by force, but by finance. To understand how the IMF became a financial superpower, we have to start with fear, the aftershock of the Great Depression and the rubble of World War II. In the 1930s, nations devalued their currencies and erected trade barriers to survive, a spiral of beggar-thy-neighbor chaos that deepened the crash. By 1944, with the world at war and peace on the horizon, leaders knew the next global order needed rules, stable exchange rates, shared responsibility, and a backstop against panic. They convened in a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a system that would tame the wildest impulses of markets and governments. Two men shaped the vision, and their shadows still cross the IMF's hallways. John Maynard Keynes wanted a global clearing union and a new currency, Bancor, to discipline both debtors and creditors. Harry Dexter White, representing the ascendant United States, had another idea: anchor the world to the dollar and anchor the dollar to gold. The compromise created twin institutions, the World Bank to rebuild, and the IMF to keep currencies honest, to lend when balance of payments crises threatened, and to surveil the systems the next depression never returned. The pact was pragmatic, not utopian stability first, sovereignty second, and a dollar at the center. The original IMF was a referee with a small whistle and a modest purse. Members paid quotas that determined how much they could borrow and how much they could vote, an early signal that money and voice would travel together. The new order pegged currencies to the US dollar, which itself was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Countries could adjust their pegs in fundamental disequilibrium, but the bias was toward discipline and predictability. In those early years, reconstruction aid came mostly from the Marshall Plan. The IMF's role was supervisory, technical quiet, not yet fearsome. By the 1960s, the system's seams began to stretch. Europe and Japan had rebuilt, trade boomed, and the dollar was both the world's lubricant and its constraint. The United States ran deficits to supply the world with dollars, exactly what global commerce needed. But those deficits undermined confidence in America's ability to convert dollars to gold on demand. Economists called it a dilemma, but for policymakers it felt like a trap. That trap snapped shut in August 1971 when President Richard Nixon broke the gold link, letting the dollar float and, in time, the world with it. In the 1970s, the IMF reinvented itself. The Jamaica Accords of 1976 formally blessed floating exchange rates, and the fund shifted from policing pegs to monitoring the macroeconomy, what it calls surveillance. Then came the oil shocks. OPEC's price surge quadrupled energy costs and pumped petrodollars into global banks. Those banks, flush and hungry, lent to developing countries at fever pace. The IMF created oil facilities to help borrowers cope. But when interest rates spiked under Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker, the tide turned and the stage was set for a long and punishing reckoning. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could not meet its payments, and the Latin American debt crisis exploded. The IMF stepped in with a template that would define a generation: emergency loans tied to conditionality, austerity to cut deficits, devaluations to restore competitiveness, liberalization to free markets, and privatization to slim the state. Some called it medicine, others called it shock therapy. For many countries, the 1980s became a lost decade, where growth slowed, inequality widened, and the social fabric frayed, even as inflation receded and debts were eventually restructured under the Brady Plan. The 1990s brought new frontiers and new controversies. Former Soviet republics and Eastern Europe turned to the IMF for guidance and cash as they tried to pivot from planned economies to markets. In Russia, the transition was chaotic, inflation raged, capital fled, and the state defaulted in 1998, igniting a crisis that rippled into Wall Street. Elsewhere, Mexico's 1994-95 tequila crisis triggered a $50 billion rescue backed by the IMF and the US Treasury. A lifeline that stabilized markets but cemented a perception. When the system was on the line, the fund would act fast, forceful, and with strings attached. Then came Asia in 1997, a shock that redefined the IMF's image across a continent. Thailand's currency peg collapsed under speculative attack. Indonesia and South Korea followed as hot money reversed and corporate debt surfaced. The IMF prescribed tight fiscal and monetary policies, banking cleanups, and corporate restructuring, measures meant to restore credibility but perceived as brutal amid recession. In Seoul and Jakarta, millions lost jobs, and the stigma of IMF programs became political poison. Malaysia defied the script with capital controls. It recovered, but the unseen cost was reputational, a warning that even partial escape leaves a mark. The early 2000s cast Argentina into the center of the IMF's most visible failure. After a decade of a currency board pegging the peso to the dollar, recession, rising debt, and political crisis led to a spectacular default in 2001. The social toll was harrowing. Banks froze accounts, unemployment soared, and a proud middle class slipped into poverty. IMF policies were blamed for sustaining an unsustainable peg too long and then demanding austerity too hard. Years later, Argentina returned to the fund, this time to receive the largest program in IMF history, proving that the gravitational pull of the institution can bend even the most defiant trajectories. In 2008-09, the global financial crisis reshaped the IMF yet again. As markets froze, the fund's resources were multiplied and new tools were introduced, flexible credit lines with fewer conditions for countries deemed strong but threatened by contagion. For the first time since the 1970s, special drawing rights SDRs, the IMF's reserve asset were allocated at scale, injecting liquidity into a panicked world. The message was clear: the IMF would not only impose discipline, it would also supply lifeblood when private finance ran for the exits. The Guardian had become a firefighter with a bigger hose and a longer reach. Europe, long a patron and architect of the fund, soon became a patient. The Eurozone crisis starting in 2010 landed Greece, Ireland, and Portugal in the arms of the Troika, the IMF. The European Commission and the European Central Bank, austerity, bailouts, and messy politics collided. Greece's economy shrank dramatically and the social fallout was profound. The IMF later admitted it underestimated fiscal multipliers, how deeply spending cuts would bite, and questioned debt sustainability in private. The episode revealed both the fund's clout and its limitations. Even as it pressed for realism, Europe's internal politics set the boundaries. Around the same time, geopolitics threaded through the fund's rulebook in ways that critics found hard to ignore. In 2015, amid conflict and crisis, Ukraine received IMF support even as it fell into arrears to an official creditor Russia, after the fund adjusted its policy to allow lending into official arrears under certain conditions. Meanwhile, China rose as a major official lender to the developing world, complicating debt workouts that once moved on Washington's timetable. The IMF's debt sustainability analysis became the arbiter of who deserved relief and on what terms. It was technical on the surface and profoundly political beneath. The pandemic stress-tested everything. In 2020, the IMF deployed rapid financing instruments to dozens of countries within weeks, while the G20 paused poor countries' debt service and created a common framework to coordinate restructuring among diverse creditors. In 2021, a $650 billion allocation of SDRs boosted global reserves, with richer nations pledging to recycle some of their windfall to the vulnerable. The fund launched a resilience and sustainability trust to support countries investing in climate and pandemic resilience, an acknowledgement that 21st century stability isn't only about exchange rates and deficits. From Sri Lanka to Zambia to Ghana, programs became passports to debt reworkings, tying local politics to the fund's spreadsheets like never before. This is how a financial weapon is forged not through conquest, but through credibility and consequences. The IMF's power rests on three pillars. It sets standards through surveillance, it supplies dollars directly or by catalyzing others, and it signals to markets whether a country is on a path that creditors can trust. A program can unlock loans from others, narrow a bond's yield, or tilt a rating agency's forecast. Conversely, the absence of a program can be a scarlet letter, inviting capital flight and forcing choices no cabinet wants to make. The price of access is conditionality, and the currency of compliance is reform. For households, the terms of that bargain are not abstract. An IMF program can lift subsidies on fuel and food, slash public payrolls, or privatize utilities, actions that steady a nation's books while stirring anger in its streets. It can force exchange rate adjustments that make exports cheaper and imports dearer, shifting pain across classrooms, clinics, and kitchen tables. Yet those same programs can stop hyperinflation, restore credit, and reopen doors that panic slammed shut. Lives improve when growth returns. But the path there is steep, and the fund's technocratic language cannot disinfect words like austerity. Is the IMF uniquely harsh or simply enforcing the laws of a world wired for fast money and fragile trust? Critics see a one-size-fits-all template that prioritizes creditors and punishes the poor, often with Western fingerprints on the keypad. Supporters argue that the fund is the scapegoat for math. If money left fast, something must change fast. If debt is too large, someone must take a loss. Over time, the IMF has softened certain edges, accepting that capital controls can be legitimate in a surge, that social safety nets matter, that sequencing reforms is as much craft as code. But every concession is negotiated in the friction between economic theory and political reality, so why can no nation escape it? Start with gravity. The dollar-centered system is the planet's circulatory network, and the IMF is its cardiologist and emergency room. Member countries, nearly every sovereign state on Earth, submit to regular article for checkups, whose findings ripple through investors, lenders, and ratings agencies. Even nations that never borrow from the fund live with the fund's vernacular, debt to GDP ratios, primary balances, reserve adequacy, because that is the language of access. A country can close itself off, but the price is isolation. And in a connected century, isolation is an economy's slow bleed. Alternatives exist, but they circle the same sun. Regional safety nets from Europe's mechanisms to Asia's Chiang Mai initiative are real, but often rely on IMF assessments or sit in its shadow. The US Federal Reserve can throw lifelines via dollar swap lines, but only to a select group of central banks, usually in advanced or strategically allied economies. The fund is the one with the near-universal mandate. China's Belt and Road lending is large and consequential, yet, when debts sour, restructuring still runs through tables where the IMF's sustainability analysis calls the rhythm. The network changes, but the conductor remains on stage. Power is not only about money, it is about the ability to define normal. The IMF's coded standards for transparency, for statistics, for what a sustainable debt path looks like, has become the invisible architecture of the global economy. In the 2010s, it integrated China's currency, the renminbi, into the SDR basket alongside the dollar, euro, yen, and pound, an acknowledgement of changing realities without surrendering the center. And as climate risk and geopolitics fuse into finance, the fund is positioning itself as a broker of just transitions, linking reforms to resilience and dollars to decarbonization. That is not empire. It is influence no less potent because it's negotiated. None of this makes the IMF infallible lore irresistible. countries can and do push back, bargain hard, and build buffers, larger foreign reserves, deeper local capital markets, and targeted capital flow measures when the storm hits. They can diversify trade partners, issue bonds in local currency, and invest in credibility long before crisis arrives. But the lesson of the past half-century is ruthless. In a world of sudden stops and stampeding narratives, every nation needs a lender of last resort it cannot create alone. Even great powers have discovered there are moments when markets trust a multilateral imprimatur more than a national promise. Which brings us back to the weapon. It is terrifying because it does not look like one. It sits in meeting rooms, speaks in footnotes, and wields spreadsheets instead of spears. It has been a savior and a scourge, sometimes in the same country within a decade. It shapes destinies through incentives and exits the picture when calm returns, leaving leaders to claim credit or bear blame. The IMF is not the world's sovereign, but in a crisis it decides who's solvent. And that, more than anything, is where its power lies. In a century where capital moves faster than politics, the institution that controls the terms of rescue controls the terms of reality. If this journey through the hidden circuitry of global power made you think, you're in the right place. Hidden Finance is where we follow the money, not the headlines, to map the forces that move nations. Subscribe, follow, and share this with someone who still thinks economics is just numbers. We know it's about power, choices, and the people caught in between. New stories drop every week across YouTube and Facebook. Until next time, this is Hidden Finance, where the biggest stories are the ones you were never meant to see.